All right. Hi, everybody. It's our CFB Talk 192. My name's Bobak Ha'Eri. I'm your co-host. I'm your main host here for a Tuesday night conversation about whatever you'd like to talk about in college football. You know, as I've said before, this is a new kind of era of off season. It really doesn't entirely quiet down. May used to be the ultimate doldrums of the sport, yet there is still stuff to talk about all the time. If you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to hit request. I'll let you up and we can talk about whatever it is you'd like to talk about. So, this past week, a couple of things wanted to hit on, one of the which, and this is kind of a sign that we're getting closer to the season. And it's been so called the college football equinox, off-season equinox, was this past week. It was the day, the halfway point between the college football playoff national championship, the last game of the season, which of course was Michigan versus Washington on January 8th. It was 115 days ago as of last Thursday. And it's 114 days, and now it's a few days sooner than that, until week 0 begins on August 24th. On a positive note, this is actually the last long the offseason is only going to get shorter because with that 12-game playoff, the game is going to creep even further into January. So this long offseason, which will be the longest offseason for many years to come, is halfway over. So that's a good news in and of that. Looking at some of the other interesting items that have come up in college football on a lighter note, I always like looking at some of these kind of light news and notes. The Arizona Bowl has a new sponsor. The Arizona Bowl, of course, it's played at University of Arizona Stadium in Tucson. Snoop Dogg is going to sponsor the Arizona Bowl with his gin and juice brand. So there's been a lot of fun had with that. I know one of the readers at our CFB, Commodore Iris, said we are now 2 degrees of separation from the Weed Bowl, although I still think the edible is one of the funnier ideas for that potential name. But that'll be an interesting one to see. I mean, it was Barstool for a couple of years there. It's always had a little bit of trouble, I think, getting sponsorship. For those who remember, the initial year it was out, it didn't even have a clear TV deal. In fact, it got completely hosed with the matchup. First year, it actually hosted a Mountain West versus Mountain West rematch before they were able to sort that out. Another interesting game that's probably another interesting kind of story that's coming up again, more timely, is some folks have been joking about, obviously there's this big rivalry right now, this big beef going on with Drake and Lamar. So one of the more amusing posts on RCFB this past week was trying to imagine the teams, Drake, which of course plays in FCS in the Pioneer Football League, versus Lamar, also an FCS school, and who would you pick to play? Who would you pick to win that? From 1973, they've only played 4 times, most recently in 1980, when Drake beat Lamar 38-7. It's currently 3-1 in favor of Drake, although one thing I would caution Drake is a non-scholarship football program. Lamar has scholarships, although they've never been particularly great in the football season. I mean, they were a playoff team last season, but that was kind of one of those that was probably my favorite of the light humor that appears in the offseason on RCFB. Would you take Drake or would you take Lamar in a college football game with those teams? On a kind of looking at the college football playoff selection committee, I was kind of happy to see Mike Riley got named to it because Pat Chung, the Wazoo athletic director, stepped down as he takes the new job at rival Washington. To replace him, they've selected the former Nebraska, former Oregon State, former Chargers head coach, Mike Riley. And for those of you who know him, he's a good guy, always been a good guy. Supremely likable. The Nebraska hire is still mysterious, but to me, during his time in Nebraska, because he's a good coach. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like you can't be good, you can't be a good person and a good coach at the same time. But he was a little bit out of his depth at Nebraska, and one of the best moments was walking around the streets of Lincoln. Apparently, there was a furry convention going on, like the people who like to wear the mascot costumes kind of for fun and other reasons. But some of them asked to pose with him. So there's this hilarious photo of Mike Riley and I think his grandkids posing with a bunch of furries. And you just know that they asked him and he couldn't help but say yes, which again, I thought sort of symbolized sort of the genuineness of the guy. Um, as one of the top posts on RCFB in referral to it was a Nebraska fan announcing ice cream for everyone, because that is absolutely the attitude we see from them. Let's see. Well, okay. So speaking of music, because we were just talking about the whole Drake versus Kendrick Lamar rivalry. Apparently, after all the brouhaha this past week, for some of you may have heard, involving the Shador Sanders, with some of the players criticizing him in that athletic article. Apparently, today he has released his first song titled "Perfect Timing." I listened to it. It's okay. It definitely, I think the timing of this release couldn't have been more awkward for a lot of reasons. The mob has sort of formed in a lot of ways. Some responses, as Clemson fan Tuna Safari wrote, this goes about as hard as the adversity he's faced. Um, some people have decided to use his own words against him and have called this new song very mid at best. Although Midor was pretty good, I gotta admit. Red Husker, credit to you for coming up with a Midor comment. But so yeah, so if you're interested in hearing a new hip hop track, check out Shador Sanders. Apparently, I was disappointed. I was hoping it would be like a country western ballad or something that you just totally didn't expect coming out of him. Speaking of that whole Twitter spat last week, Deion Sanders has admitted he's got to do better, but I was bored, which kind of does bring up the fact that, how does a coach of a major D1 program have time to be bored? Some of you may remember, as in Vodka Veritas pointed out, he doesn't do home visits for recruiting. In fact, the entire recruiting approach of Colorado is so different that maybe that gives him more time to get into spats on Twitter. But he, I guess, has some remorse on that. I mean, the timing of it, I kind of get why he stepped in when he did, because it was turning into kind of critiques of his kid, but his kid kind of started it. I'm more willing to forgive any college football player for getting into like a stupid argument. Like, okay, fine, I was 18, I was 20, I remember how dumb I could be, but it was a little weirder seeing a coach get into the middle of it. Speaking of recruit signees, one of the more interesting stories, because normally I don't care too much about reporting about arrests. I mean, there's 40,000 college football players at any given time. So one or two of them getting arrested in a given time, that's actually oftentimes, if you do the math, it's lower than the rest of the population. But an interesting story came out, and we're still trying to get the details. It's annoying. The story's over 3 days old, but Auburn has a four-star defensive line signee, Jamonta Waller, who was arrested in Mississippi last Friday. It's not for some, and to be clear, he was part of many students arrested because allegedly he and 30 other students did a high school prank that went out of control for their senior year. And again, it's not clear who did what and who was arrested for what. But the gym was allegedly flooded. And the one that really got people's attention is people stole a school bus, and that also got the police involved in all of this. It's been described by the sheriff as a prank that went out of control. So, yeah, people have been having fun with that idea that the Javonte Wallers was arrested for stealing a school bus along with 20 of his friends, or at least 30 people were involved, but I believe they arrested 20 some. So it was just kind of one of those oddball things that appeared back when the Fulmer Cup was a thing. That would have definitely been one that would have at least earned some attention. Again, it's so weird. It's been such a busy week that it's weird to think that this was before last show. I wanted to also mention, again, if you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to hit request. We can talk about whatever you would like to talk about. But I'm just going to kind of go through some headlines as we do this. But EA College Sports 25, obviously a game that's hotly anticipated with a lot of folks. I'm kind of in the middle on it. They're going to have apparently several broadcast teams, depending on the magnitude of the game. So it's not going to just be, Fowler and Herb Street was what it was when I last played the game. But some of the funny ideas that are out there is, nice. We've got the Big Ten CBS game. Big news for my Rutgers dynasty. This is from a habanero enjoyer. And 80% of Gary's voice lines are going to be about Alabama, just to give you the real experience. Let's see here. Our friend from Pitt, Dr. Pepper Bucko, I'm going to let you up. You've hit request. Talk about what you'd like to talk about here. Then we can talk a little bit about the portal, only because there's some great ones that came out here. For just to kind of update people on the portal. Last week, of course, last Tuesday was the deadline to get paperwork in, but you didn't have to pick a team. It just means your name's in the portal and you're still on the open market. So there's quite a few players out there, excuse me, who have yet to find a home. One of the people on the market is Oklahoma transfer quarterback General Booty, a name that all of us remember, and apparently Iowa is courting him to command their revamped offense. And my goodness, the reputation of the Iowa offense, even with Brian Ferentz no longer being there, and the idea of General Booty being on the team is going to just lend itself to a whole bunch of humor. As some folks have joked, El Assico is going to take on a whole new meaning. But let's see here, Dr. Pepper Bucko, what's on your mind?
What's up? Just go on. Just
you just wanted to be up here. All right, that's fine. So let's see. Another one of the interesting transfers, only because I was kind of surprised at the direction he took, was Sam Horde. And he's part of a family. Many of you probably know Brock Horde because he does broadcasts now for college football. That's his uncle, his father, Damon Hurd. Both of them played football for Washington. Both of them were solid quarterbacks that at least had some bit of an NFL career. He went from Washington. He was a 5-star quarterback recruit to Cal Poly SLO this past season, and now he's apparently transferring to Utah. Now, Utah's got a great quarterback. I mean, Cam Rising is going to be there as long as he's healthy. He didn't play last season, but he was a quarterback for the Utah team that went and won back-to-back Pac-12 when it existed Pac-12 titles. But that'll be an interesting backup to see there and strengthen the hands of the Utes, as they seem to be at least one of the, I'm not going to say the favorite, but one of the leads to potentially win the Big 12 this season. And that's important because with the 12-team playoff, just as a reminder, if you the P4 plus whoever is the best champion in the G5 are going to automatically be in this playoff. So even if you're not ranked in the top 4, even in the top 12, and I doubt that would happen for a P4 conference, it means you're going to be not only in the playoff, but you're going to be one of the top 4 seeds and get a bye. So that means it's going to be obviously the P4. So whoever wins the Big 12 is going to be one of those. And I think arguably the best teams in the Big 12, the ones that people are going to be looking to, are going to include Utah, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Kansas and Arizona as well. I mean, we'll see on those two, but I think those are all definitely teams to keep an eye on as we head into that. Let's see. We have someone else who wants to join in. Eddie the Aggie, we'll let you up here as well. Feel free to join the conversation. We always enjoy that. Another interesting kind of portal factoid: 4 FBS teams took 0 incoming transfers in 2024, and they are, well, you're going to see a theme with the first 3: Army, Navy, and Air Force, and Clemson. So the Clemson had 12 people go out, 0 people come in, at least via transfer. And then the 3 service academies had no one come in, but similar numbers leaving. We'll see how that
blended.
Yeah, we'll see how that pans out for them. But anyway, Eddie the Aggie, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for giving me a chance to speak.
Of course.
I'm a A&M fan. Just wanted to get your take on Mike Elko and what kind of direction he's going to take the program and expectations for this year, just kind of as you see it, and just your impressions overall. I don't know if you saw it, but they some early Vegas, or might have been DraftKings, some lines came out, and A&M's favored in 11 out of 12 games, except against Texas this season.
Wow, that's a generous one.
Yeah, over under was 8.5.
Yeah, because
for games.
Yeah, because I definitely think Texas A&M has, while I wouldn't necessarily say they're favored to make the playoff, they would not be a shocker if they did, only because Elko's taking over a team, which even though they lost guys, they still, Jimbo stalked that team pretty thoroughly. So I'm just glancing at that. Notre Dame game will definitely set the tone, I think, for sure, because they open with that, and that's going to be an exciting game at Kyle Field. But I'm just kind of eyeballing this. Like,
favorable schedule.
were they just thinking Texas was going to be the challenger? Maybe LSU and Mizzou?
It's a favorable schedule. We don't play Bama, Georgia, Ole Miss, or Tennessee. And
Yeah.
a lot of our tough games are at home. LSU, Notre Dame, Texas, and Missouri.
Yeah, that is striking. You're right. They're all four at home. Yeah, I mean, because I was going to say, I think my expectations for Texas A&M under Mike Elko are higher than they would be for a lot of other new coaches. Like Arizona, for example, we're just talking about them briefly. Brent Brennan, no disrespect, but that's going to be a tall order, because to pull off what they did last year with that took the time to build. That was kind of not expected for Arizona entirely. And they keep a couple key players, but it's not as thorough as you get with A&M, because again, we'll see how Connor Wakeman does. I think that it's not to be cliche, but I mean, obviously he's going to set the tone for that program. Excited to see how he plays under Colin Klein. Texas A&M with that schedule should be, I think, certainly bowling. But I think playoff is reasonable, but it would take a couple of things to break their way. And yeah, I think because the problem is Mizzou's in the same boat. I mean, they did great last season. They lost a couple of key people, but they kept some excellent. They kept their quarter. I mean, they kept that Luther Burden. Oh my gosh, sorry, can you tell it's late? Luther Burden's still there, and they've got a couple of weapons to kind of make that work. They lost that defensive coordinator to LSU, so I mean, there's a little bit of a question there if there's going to be kind of drop off. But LSU, we'll see. I mean, when you lose a Heisman-winning quarterback and you're kind of trying to get a defense, we'll learn a lot about LSU in week one as well, because they've got the USC game, and we'll see two teams that had supposedly great offensive talent, but defenses that occasionally let them down. And Texas is Texas. Texas, in my mind, is of all that schedule, Texas is going to be the hardest game. But at least by the time you reach them, hopefully no injuries aside, you'll have a team that'll be, if it is firing on all cylinders, it's going to be pretty unstoppable at that point, or at least pretty tough for them at that point. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, I agree with a lot of your points. I think I'm about 8-9 wins. Not right now. I mean, I'm not expecting playoffs year one for Elko. I mean, I think the ceiling, though, we've got the most returning production in the SEC. Wegman's getting draft and some draft hype, and he's got Heisman odds. We were scoring 44 points a game before he went down in September against Auburn, and he's got a top 5 win over LSU. The end of his freshman year there. He outplayed Jackson Dart his first start against Ole Miss, 330 yards, 4 touchdowns. So that was with Jimbo's scheme. I mean, he was kind of playing above Jimbo's scheme, which was the most impressive thing. So, but yeah, with Colin Klein, he had the number 10 scoring offense in FBS, with a bunch of 3-stars over there at Kansas State. So that we've seen the Elko defense cook in the SEC already. His last season with Jimbo, they were the 3rd best scoring defense in the country and the 14th best overall defense. And he did 9 wins at a basketball school at Duke, 2 years ago. And last year he was 4-0 with a win over number 9 Clemson, just dominated them and had Notre Dame on the ropes before his QB went down in the 4th quarter, for extended time last season. So yeah, I think, there's room. I think there's a better chance of getting more than 8-9 wins than less. I mean, Jimbo stumbled his way to 7 wins last year without Connor Wegman, after September. So, I think Elko can certainly do the same or do better on that. He's got the number 2 portal class also.
Yeah, because my whole thing is if Sonny Dykes could turn TCU around that radically, and again, obviously there was a drop off this past season, but that changed my entire view on what's theoretically possible. Because if you can do that at TCU, imagine if you have that kind of lightning in a bottle at Texas A&M with the talent where when you eventually do face a team like Georgia, you could theoretically go toe-to-toe with them. That's where I'm thinking like that. Because of that, I've become a lot more willing to be positive about new coaching hires suddenly having a hell of a run. But yeah, I think you have very realistic expectations. I think anything less than 8 wins would be a complete disaster, would be a shock. But I think at this point, 8 seems to be the floor, if not 9, realistically.
Good stuff.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. Let's see here. Mage Ingrid, I see you. I'm going to let you up. An interesting kind of note here that because this kind of goes into this ESPN, or at least Disney reported really high earnings because they actually are apparently unexpectedly, or at least sooner than even they predicted, making money off of Disney Plus. So as part of kind of as they're rejiggering and putting the program together, apparently they're going to be working, I believe, part of what was ESPN Plus into Disney Plus in 2024 to kind of, I think, blended somewhat. I'm not sure if they're all of the ESPN Plus games, but at least some of them. They're calling it ESPN Tile to be added. So that must be in, I guess, the interface. So the way I'm reading that, but that'll be interesting to see, especially as we kind of see the shift, as we've talked about, kind of a macro level, the shift to streaming services and how they'll affect the sport. That is one to keep an eye on, only because that's been a very popular streaming service. It's clearly now making money, which is rare, extremely rare. Most of these streaming services lose money, and that'll be part of it. Let's see here. Mage Ingrid, what's going on?
Oh, good evening. How y'all
Hey,
doing?
good.
Okay, how was that Southern Oregon game during last weekend?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So, for those who aren't familiar, and I actually was there for 4 or 5 days, I think, altogether. There was a really unique game, and I had to cover it because it just was interesting. And I know more than just about anybody in the United States about the other team. So, Southern Oregon, NAIA, so kind of like it's somewhere, it's closer to D2 than any other level. They have some scholarships. They could just do a few more things than they can do at D2, although they don't have as many scholarships. But anyway, Southern Oregon, it's in Ashland, Oregon, which is near Medford, which is in the south of the state. So they have this historical tie to a university in Japan, because the coach in the 1980s at Southern Oregon was a coach who, at a previous stop at Utah State, took the first American football team, the Utah State Aggies, in 1971 on a tour of Japan, where they played, because Japan had college football since the 1930s. They took a short break in the 40s. You could probably guess why. And then they brought it back, and it was, it was going okay. So Utah State comes in, plays some all-star teams in Japan, and just obliterates them, unsurprisingly. But the Japanese really kind of were like, they consider that the moment modern football started in Japan, because they looked at how Utah State was playing. They said, like, wow, they're actually, like, they've developed new strategies. They do things we never even thought to do, like tape ankles. Like, it's kind of funny when you think about it, right? So the coach of that team, Chuck Mills, he wasn't just a guy who was like, I'm going to go there and clobber the Japanese and come home. He actually said, like, you know what, I'm going to help you guys. So he always offered an open invitation to any former players or current coaches to come and just be on his teams as like a what you consider, an analyst role, just to learn how we coach in the United States. So when he was at Utah State, when he was at Wake Forest, and then when he was at Southern Oregon, he always had Japanese coaches coming over and coaching with him. And so during his time in the 80s, that was when the Japanese economy was really strong. So these trips were easy for them to just kind of throw money at. There was this 3-game series between the two schools. They split it 2-1 in favor of Southern Oregon. Now, nearly 40 years later, they decided to resurrect the game. So the Japanese team, Kwansei Gakuin University, which is KG, is what they call them. KG fighters came from the Osaka area to play them last weekend in an exhibition game, because it was a benchmarking game, because that KG team is really good in Japan. It reminds me of an old movie called Singles, where a band was always like, we're big in Belgium. Yeah, okay, well, in Japan they're a hit. They've won 34 national championships since 1949, 60 conference titles. So they're serious business, and they're on a 6 national championship streak, which is, in that, again, unprecedented for them. So they came over, and it was a benchmarking test, because how do they do against, an NAIA team that's not bad? Like, they had a first-year coach, Coach Burke Brown. the record doesn't look good on paper, 6-4, but they really turned it around and went 5-1 and upset a top ranked team in their final week of the regular season. So how would they compete against a team like that? And it was a win-win, because for the Southern Oregon, they got to play a team. They have a bunch of young defensive players. Now they got film and they can tweak on how their players were playing before they start their fall season. And the Japanese wanted to see how they do it against an American team. So I was there. I flew in actually the same night the Japanese team got there. I watched 2 practices of the Japanese team, a practice and a half of Southern Oregon, and then they had a joint practice, which was also interesting to watch before the game last Saturday. And the Japanese team, it was really interesting. They had a couple of interesting guests there. Like there was Kent Baer, who's a coach who's coached for almost 50 years. He was on that 1971 team at Utah State, but he ended up becoming a very successful defensive coordinator. Like he was a coordinator for Notre Dame. He was actually interim head coach of Notre Dame when they fired Tyrone Willingham back in the day. But, he'd been at Colorado, Stanford, so he knew a lot about defense. And so I was able to just ask him a question during one of the practices. I'm like, look, the big question is the size difference, because there is a size difference on the line. I mean, the biggest guys in Japan, they have high school and college clubs in sumo. That's what they kind of go towards, because that's what they probably grew up watching. But how about for the football players? Because football is more of a club sport in Japan. It's like a super duper club sport in that the players buy their own equipment. They, the coaches a lot of times have other jobs. Either they're professors at the university or, they're commuting to work every day. So they're playing for the love of the sport. I said, how do you think these guys are going to do up against this team? Can they make the line play relevant? And he said, they're very good at schemes. So if they can scheme well, they'll be able to hopefully fend off this line. Now, the final score was pretty lopsided, but I want to be clear, it wasn't because of the line play. Southern Oregon was able to really kind of wear down KG in the second half. So what was a closer game turned into a blowout. It was 54-24 final. But watching the game initially, first of all, there were a couple of it was a rainy game. I had to stand on the sideline because they don't have a press box at that university. First of all, I am completely sold on outdoor research jackets, because that shell, I did not get soaked under it because it was 40 degrees and raining the whole game. I stayed dry. So you want to learn to sell something, that won me over. But watching them play was interesting. I think they made a couple of the opening kickoff, which they received at KG, slipped out of the guy's hands, lost possession. They threw an interception. Those were the only 2 turnovers for that team, but it put them in a hole real quick. So they were able to climb up. They got close enough within a field goal. But then by the second half, and again, I was talking to Coach Burke Brown, they realized that who they needed to isolate, because it was fascinating. I had another coaching friend who was in the audience, and he noticed that the way KG was scheming, all of their offensive plays were trying to get one person open. Clearly, like they were, running, diversions, things to kind of fool the defense, but it was always clear they were trying to get one player open. And because of that, once Coach Burke was able to adjust that defense, they were really able to corral them. And it was interesting to also watch, because when I talked to the head coach of KG, he told me that, the way we usually practice for games is a lot of scheme. And one thing I did notice watching their practices, they don't do as much contact as we do. It was really striking to go back-to-back practices between KG and Southern Oregon. Southern Oregon was no different than you've probably ever seen if you've ever been in a football practice or seen a football practice. Lots of fun, loud music, hooting and hollering, people in pads banging up against each other, while they weren't always fully padded up. They had helmets on, but they were mostly just planning offensive schemes and things like that. And part of it made sense because they don't really have the same level of university structure for their athletic programs. And that's something where I realized that's a change since the 80s when they first had this series. In the 80s, I could see where D3, D2, NAIA teams were pretty similar. And, there wasn't this arms race that has now permeated all levels of the sport. Because now when you talk about FBS, we talk about the very top of the FBS. We know what kind of money they're spending there, especially before NIL started diverting some of it. They have an enormous amount of facilities, an enormous amount of staff. I'd be really curious. Somebody should sit down and actually figure out, like Ohio State Texas, Alabama, Georgia, how much they're spending per football player. It just in terms of like the support staff, the facilities to help them. I'm not saying like the fancy locker rooms. I'm talking about just the amount of money to develop these athletes into the best they can be, to be these NFL draft picks that they become. They're not paying anything like that in Japan. Japan, as I said, is like a club team. So I think that was the other factor in this, where even though NAIA is nowhere near the level of it, everyone's trying to be like the teams that are above them. Even the very top teams, even like the Georgia, they're trying to be more like the NFL with how they train their players up, how they develop their players. So I think that what we saw this past weekend in Oregon was the fact that the Japanese have not caught up in that aspect. That said, when you're looking at guys who don't need to be physically developed the same way, they had a kicker who I honestly could not believe. Like I'm going to look up his name because I have to put respect on his name. Yuta Onishi. This guy, I was at the practices, we were watching him boot 60-yard field goals like it was no problem. I mean, with leg to spare. During the game, they only needed to call on him once for a field goal. It was raining. It was, wind in the opposite direction. 47-yard field goal, just nailed the kick. Nailed it completely with them. Obviously, with the size difference, you're really worried about how the line is going to protect the kicker in that kind of a play. But no, he booted it. So part of me was thinking, why doesn't what do the transfer rules work like if you're trying to pull a guy from another country at a university? When did his clock start ticking on NCAA time? But that was the player I would take if you could steal anyone from that game. Steal that kicker from the KG Fighters because he was a hell of a kicker. So lots of observations there. Sorry to kind of go on that, but I literally have written like 3 articles and talked about it on another show. But it was absolutely fascinating to watch that, and lots of kind people there. It was a really cool atmosphere because it was a friendly game. Afterwards, a lot of handshakes from the players, lots of kind of fun pictures being taken with each other. I think everyone involved, other than perhaps, it stung to see them lose by that amount, but it was a good experience overall. Dr. Pepper Bucko, I see your hand up.
Compare that kicker to another kicker.
Gosh. Well, the kid is reliable. The thing is, like, every time we'll occasionally get one of these Japanese games late at night that some people watch, everyone always comments on the kickers because they can kick really far. It makes sense because, a lot of other countries, plenty of other sports where, soccer, etc. Obviously, people have figured out the secret about Australia and their ability to have guys who can kick because of Aussie rules. But he seemed he's just he just seemed like I didn't see him enough times like in game conditions, but he's clearly the premier kicker in that country because the guy just had ice in his veins. I did not see him miss a kick the entire week. And went 6, including extra points, he went 4 for 4. And he was doing everything too because they didn't have a second guy. So he was also their punter and their kickoff guy, but really it was his field goals that struck me the most. I'm not sure who to compare him against though, because if I were recruiting, he would be a target because anyone who's watched enough high school games know that it's hard to get a kicker who can kick reliably past a certain point. I don't know if I'd give him a scholarship, but certainly give him a try. Maybe, hey, there's some schools out there with international appeal, Stanford, UCLA, a couple of schools were really popular on the Pacific Rim. Just get him in. We'll be a walk-on. Probably be happy to fly over and join the team and see how good he is in practice. But all right, so I don't want to just completely divert the entire show to that, but thanks to Mage Ingrid for asking that question. As I mentioned at the outset, the portal, even though it's closed for people to enter it, there's still plenty of good players in it. We're going to see how they kind of land. I know the Athletic keeps a good running list. I believe it's Max Olson keeps that running list of teams or probably players that are still out there. The ones, a very interesting note, like Kent State has a defensive tackle, CJ West. Surprised he hasn't finalized it yet. Technically, I believe the deadline for them to pick teams depends on the school they would go to and when they need to be enrolled by. So some of the names out there could last a while. There's a cornerback, Terrence Brooks from Texas, Jacoby Matthews from Texas A&M. He's a defensive back, and they can always return to their same team. Another Texas A&M offensive lineman, Bryce Foster. Cormani McLean, the cornerback from Colorado, who kind of seemed to have a little bit of a tiff with Dion over not necessarily being on the same level as Travis Hunter. He's out there as well. We'll see if he lands somewhere. I don't think he's going back there. But of course, the big names that did land, Damian Martinez, that Oregon State running back, went to Miami as was expected. Arizona was able to keep Takario Davis, that excellent cornerback. Demonic Williams from TCU to Oklahoma. That was another big one to see him move. Again, there's some other names out there. I could go on and on and on, but it was interesting to kind of see that. Of course, and Jaden Rashada heading over to Georgia to be a backup was interesting. And I think that speaks something to him. I mean, because they pulled him up to be a starter late in the middle of the season at Arizona State. He got a little banged up. I think he's willing to wait and see how he would do after Carson Beck presumably moves on. Oh, and Penny Boone, that really interesting kind of story with him, because he started at Maryland, ended up at Toledo, where he was the MAC Offensive Player of the Year, transferred to Louisville, and immediately in December, and is now transferred out. He's going to UCF. That's going to be a really interesting one, because UCF is put together an interesting team over there, and they'll potentially surprise some folks in the Big 12. I think this upcoming season. I'm not saying they're necessarily a contender like the others we mentioned earlier, but they'll be one to look out for. On a kind of a lighter note on the portal stuff, Colorado, and among the players they lost was their long snapper, Cameron Warchuk, transfers to Washington. And I'm going to credit Huskies fan Spider Dog for this one. How many war could a Warchuk chuck if a Warchuk could chuck wars? So anyway, couldn't resist that one. And one other good name in there. UTSA's linebacker Pig Cage is also in the portal. I don't know anything about him, but despite all his rage, he is still Pig Cage. Boy, that was terrible. That was terrible. All right. So again, if you'd like to join the conversation, you can always hit request. Another kind of, I always like, and these started a few years ago when NIL arrived on the scene. There were obviously some folks were using the money to do charitable things and help others. So Dylan Gabriel, who of course he's originally from Hawaii, was at UCF, was at Oklahoma, and is now the presumed starter at Oregon by all accounts. So he's going to be leading a very strong not only playoff contender, but truly championship contender. I think they are, at this point, it's become the consensus that they are second to Ohio State in the Big Ten in this upcoming season. And could that big game in October when Autzen, where Ohio State's going to play Oregon, is probably going to be the number one game, I think, heading into the season. I mean, it could change, but I mean, heading into the season, that's the big one I'm looking to. But so Dylan Gabriel has used his NIL rights to basically fund Nike designed uniforms for teams at his former high school in Hawaii, Mililani High School. So I thought that was interesting. He participated in a sponsored free event with sponsorship dollars going to the uniforms, designs, and purchases. From what I heard, I think it's topped over $250,000. So that's great. That's a kid doing the right thing, because he's already got fame right now. So it's nice to see that. Let's see. We got someone who wants to join in the conversation. Chris in Georgia. Chris in Georgia, what's on your mind?
Hey, so it's talking season, and a bunch of coaching rankings have came out, and I've had this question. I know that they're kind of combined or bonded due to the schools they've coached at, but everybody gushes constantly over Lane Kiffin and his offensive mind, despite him never having a top 10 scoring offense, even at Alabama with Alabama talent. He's had schools like Tennessee, USC, still didn't have top 10 scoring offenses. Everybody automatically assumes that he's going to have a top 10 offense this year, despite before, like I said, never doing it. But then when they discuss Josh Heupel, people are like, well, I mean, the guy's had a top 10 scoring offense 5 of the last 6 years. He took a step back with Joe Milton, still had a top, I want to say 35 scoring offense. He's got one of the better quarterbacks at a high school. And people are just like, you got to prove it to me. You got to prove it to me with him. Is it just because the man's not brash? If he came out and was an a-hole like Lane Kiffin does a lot, or Like I've never understood the prove it to me with Josh Heupel, but then Lane Kiffin gets all the benefits of the doubt.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was funny too because I was almost expecting this to be a comparison with Sark. You're like, because I was thinking of two guys that coached together. You know, I still remember they were both kind of getting their start under Pete Carroll's staff. But yeah, no, that's interesting too. And I wonder why. Because is it because at Kiffin's, his past, he was at those big programs, and and he had been a head coach at least several times. While maybe it's because Heupel's last stop was UCF. It's not like he did bad there.
I mean, he was 2-0. Like people are. My thing is if you do a resume comparison, if you look at Lane Kiffin's best win, he had to win against Oregon at USC when he had nothing to lose, so he played all out and he beat a good Oregon. Before he beat Penn State this year, that was his last top 20 win. A school that finished top 20, that was his last top 20 win. But everybody gushes over his success at Ole Miss. Tennessee, I mean, Josh Heupel came into Tennessee. They had 60 scholarship players when the season started in 2021. The man's beat the dog crap out of LSU on the road in Death Valley, a division champ LSU. He beat an ACC champ Clemson. He beat Alabama. And Lane's done none of these things. His best win, Penn State, would probably be Josh Heupel's third or fourth best win at Tennessee so far, but everybody gushes over this, man. And I don't want to sound like sour grapes because I know Lane used to be at Tennessee. It's like if you look at their resumes, head-to-head, Josh Heupel's 2-1. He lost to him his first year at Tennessee, but he beat him twice at UCF when Lane was at FAU. And everybody wants to say, well, there's a talent disparity. Dylan Gabriel, he beat him with Dylan Gabriel, who was a 3-star. This man was taking every 5-star, 4-star washout from Oklahoma, Florida State, Alabama. If a kid washed out was a top 100 kid, Lane Kiffin took him. He was Dion before Dion was Dion. And people are like, well, he didn't have no talent at FAU. Yes, he did. That's the whole reason why he won 10 games at FAU is because he was last chance U.
Yeah, I and I agree. The FAU thing is you've got to just put it in a different category because it's not the same thing as playing in the SEC against. And I mean, gosh, I sound like I've drank the ESPN Kool-Aid there, but I mean, no, it really is. Week in and week out, it's a very different animal. And especially last season, Josh Heupel, I mean, it's God, the moment he beat Alabama, he earned that cigar. You know what I mean? Like that was still a solid Alabama team. And you're right, he beat when you go through, beat a ranked, was it Pitt, Florida, LSU, Alabama, Kentucky when they were ranked. And there's no regret. Okay, you can't win them all in some certain seasons. So losing at the eventual champion, Georgia, not a bad look. Not a bad look. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
I hear what
I said, yeah, 100%. I mean, like his law, and that's what, like,
well, you're right. I just want to say you are right though, because Lane. Yeah. This is what Lane's known for not doing. He's that's why the joke is, the two teams most benefiting from the 12-team playoff are Penn State and Ole Miss, because when it comes to the big game, they just can't pull it off. So Lane could eventually do that, and I think is that it? I wonder, that's kind of a quirk about USC historically that I wonder if it rubbed off on Lane for some reason, where USC would always kind of get like Notre Dame the benefit of the doubt, like, oh no, it's going to be the glory days, they're going to go through and win it all, and then they just don't quite do it. Is Lane Kiffin like this? Is he that except as a head coach? Like this is the year. This is going to be the year he puts it all together, and it doesn't quite work out.
I think having Monty Kiffin as a dad too has been. I mean, that's how he got into coaching. Was he literally got replaced by David Carr, and he went to his dorm room, called his dad, and cried, and they were like, "Your new quarterback is Lane Kiffin." That's literally how he got his starting coaching at Fresno State, and it's benefited him his whole life. He got his last name got him the Oakland Raiders job.
Oh my goodness! Let me tell you, I have a funny story about that only because David Carr. I'm old enough where, so Lane's only, I think, a year older than me, maybe 2 years older than me. So the kid from my high school in the Central Valley of California, who did go to play football at D1 school, actually went to Fresno State. So he was on that same roster. And he was the presumed starter until he got pissed off the coach. And then the other kid from Bakersfield went first, and that was David Carr. Can you imagine? But yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm following everything you're saying. I'm not just, but it's just like, man, it's so funny to make a reference to that because it's crazy to think I'm not old enough to say, like, yeah, I actually know somebody who was in the background of that. But yeah, no, it's interesting to see that, and I'm very curious to see how Tennessee does this season because that kid, and I swear I will get Nico's last name right one day.
If you say like Male, like the Molly, and then Ava is how he pronounces it. That's how
Maliava. Maliava. That's great. That was wonderful. Yeah, I could nail that. We're all going to learn it. We're all going to learn it at one point or another. That's for sure. Because he looks phenomenal. I mean, he looked great in the bowl game against Iowa. I think Tennessee's got something here. I'm curious to see how far it can go.
I said, I hope so, man. I think they'll have a good D line. I think they'll have one of the better. Like they had a sneaky good D line last year. Their D line was top 3 in the conference in havoc rate, sacks, tackles for loss, and yards per rush allowed, which are all the things you want your D line to be good at. And they return everybody. Tyler Barron transferred out. He got kind of lazy at the end of the season. If you look at his stats, he had like 4 or 5 sacks in the first 3 games against Virginia and some buy-in games, and then he trailed off at the end of the season. And then Roman Harrison graduated. He ran out of eligibility. He had a couple sacks, but I mean, they returned the interior. They returned James Pierce, who is on some sites a projected number 1 overall pick at defensive end. So that D line, I think, will benefit them. If the offense does what Josh Heupel's offenses do 85-90% of the time, then they could be a force.
The real benchmark game for me in Tennessee actually is in week 2, the neutral site game in Charlotte against North Carolina State, because NC State, I think, is kind of I wouldn't say they're quite held in as high regard going into the season as Tennessee, but they're going to be a top 25 team. And especially they got Grayson McCall, that Coastal Carolina QB. It'll be really interesting to see what they can put together because I think Dave Doran knows how to put together an offense, and I think they're the dark horse of the ACC, like realistic dark horse of the ACC. When you're not talking Florida State, when you're not talking obviously Clemson and Louisville, I think they've earned a spot in that kind of that grouping. But I'm very curious to see how NC State does. So that game in Charlotte with Tennessee is going to be one of those early games where we're going to learn a lot. I think, hopefully, about one of those two teams.
Yeah, I'm curious to see. I'm curious to see Grayson McCall. He didn't do so hot last year. I think, oddly enough, the OC from NC State, Tim Beck, I think it was, went over for Jamie Chadwell, and Grayson just fell off under that offense. I'm curious. Like, I hope the kid does well. I think Tennessee was actually looking at him after his sophomore year, his first really good year when Jeremy Pruitt was still there. People were talking about trying to get Jamie Chadwell as our head coach and then bringing Grayson in, but Danny White went in a different direction. But I'd like to see the kid do well in every game, but that one. But I'm a little worried that he might be a system quarterback. Like Jamie Chadwell runs a system. Nobody denies that. It's kind of like a Dave Clawson type situation. Like, hey, this quarterback, Jamie Newman, looks like a stud, and then he goes to Georgia and he ends up being third string and sitting out of the season. And then Sam Hartman, everybody's like, oh my God, this kid's he's the next coming. He could be a first round draft pick. And then look how his season went. And you're like, is Dave Clawson making these dudes or are they actually good quarterbacks? We don't know. I worry about Grayson being the same way. If he's not going to start at Liberty because they've got Caden Salter and he's not going to take his spot, but following Jamie Chadwell might have been the move if he could have done it when he had the chance.
Yeah, Chadwell's definitely proven his ability. It's striking, that I mean, Liberty is willing to spend money though, so it's not like he's not getting compensated. But I was surprised it took so long for him to get into a spot. Kind of just quickly, let's see. We usually go for about an hour, so I'm going to kind of again, if you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to.
Thanks for taking my call, man.
Absolutely, Chris. Thanks for joining. Anytime, man. Anytime. You can always hit request, but I'll just go through a couple of other news, odds, and ends here. So Ross Dellinger, I always love his reporting. He's at Yahoo Sports. He has been good about following a lot of what goes on the business and kind of, to a lesser extent, legal side of the college football world here, especially in the NCAA at the top level, because we are in an era where things have obviously changed quite a bit in the last 5 years. And the biggest change is actually quite possibly on the horizon. And that is we're almost certainly going to see, and I've said this every show, in the next couple of years or less, we're going to see the players ruled probably in a court of law or through an administrative ruling, aka through the NLRB, as employees. But the other big thing that is happening in the background is one of the lawsuits, the NCAA versus House. This case is important because, first of all, by all you can't entirely predict legal results, but the courts are almost certainly going to probably find in favor of the plaintiffs. It's a case that is trying to get back pay for basically as long the law only allows you to sue because there's statutes of limitations and things, basically for the maximum amount of people. So I believe the last 4 years before the NIL model was created, to give NIL funds or some kind of payment to all of those players, which, adding it all together, it's like, $2 billion in change. That's not small change, but about $2 billion, under $3 billion. They don't want this to go to the trial. Is not a desirable one, because the problem with a trial, even if you have a chance of winning, you always, of course, have a chance of losing. And if you lose a trial like that, something called treble damages could kick in because of the type of lawsuit they're in. Treble damages literally means it's times 3. So when you're talking could end up being like, oh gosh, $8 billion, especially if it's on the higher range of the 2 point whatever billion. Then there's a reason to try and come to a settlement. And the settlements that are coming up, and this is where Ross has been quite good about reporting. Apparently, they're trying to come up with a way to basically not only pay the past athletes, but come up with a revenue sharing model. And the revenue sharing model would be apparently the way it's been described, it's like $17 to $22 million per year. Teams can choose how much they want to distribute. So obviously some teams get more than others. The idea of the $2.9 billion in damages, that would be something that would be basically the way the schools would be enforced is they would get a few $1 million less each year in like TV distribution, and that money would get diverted to paying off this settlement, the damages. So it wouldn't be like the school suddenly have to front hundreds of millions of dollars or something like that. This is something that is really hot right now because apparently from what I understand, the plaintiffs' attorneys have given the defendants a 40-day window roughly to come up with a negotiated settlement before they continue on with the lawsuit and potentially cost the university so much more. This is the case where if there was something that was going to blow up the NCAA and potentially cause us to figure out what we have to build next, it was going to be this case. So that's why you're going to occasionally hear discussions about this, and it's kind of lame. It's in May, so this is the quietest part of the off season for a lot of folks. But this is one of the biggest issues that really is it's existential to whether or not college football will exist in the same way that we know it now. But I'm just putting that out there because it's been a point of discussion. Interestingly enough, a friend of mine who I've talked to on one of these RCFB talks when we do interviews, as well as on other shows, Michael McCann is a professor at the University of New Hampshire and he used to write for SI, now he writes for Sportico. He wrote a law review article. So this is dry reading. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you guys. For the Harvard Law and Harvard, not Harvard Law Review, but Harvard Journal of Sports and Entertainment Law. He recently published, and he's put a link to it on his Twitter account, so you don't have to go through one of those academic sites that require subscriptions. But basically, he takes a legal look at how there could be different vehicles for payment to basically cover the compensation model for potential student athlete settlement. looks at the possibilities of collective bargaining, representation by SAG-AFTRA, because apparently that's one of the unions that they're trying to get involved in some of this litigation. The article recommends that the NCAA and member institutions collaborate with athletes on solutions instead of waiting for a judicial order that would command a change. And that's kind of goes back to what I was just talking about with the Ross Dellinger piece. This idea of coming up with a settlement. If you can settle, you can at the very least, it won't be perfect. It wouldn't be what the NCAA and the schools would like. Because let's keep that in mind. The NCAA just does what the college presidents wants it to do. It's not like the NCAA is sitting out there laughing on a pile of money. They're literally being directed by the universities that are laughing on piles of money. So the idea is, in a settlement, you may not get exactly what you want, but you can at least control it somewhat. Because if you leave it to a court can come up with a ruling that will be much more detrimental, and that would be potentially more harmful, or at least more disruptive than what we would like otherwise. So I'm just going to put that article out there. You can go to Michael McCann's Twitter account. He's got a link to it really early on, if you're into that sort of thing, or if you want to share it with a lawyer friend to impress them that you happen to know about that article. A couple other interesting news and notes. John Canzano, who's, again, he's originally from the Oregonian. He now writes his own website and is all about trying to figure out what's happening to Oregon State and Wazoo now that they are kind of on their own as the Pac-2. They're in the middle of TV contract rights on what to do with their home games. It looks like it's going to involve the CW and Fox. Now, he's been spitballing numbers out here, so let's be clear. He's admitted he doesn't know if these numbers are accurate. But yesterday, he said the expected distribution for the Pac-2 media deal would be about $5 to $9 million range per school. That's obviously way below what the P4 are getting, but it would be commensurate with what we see in G5 deals. For example, the highest deal currently in the G5 is what goes to the American Conference, and that's $7 million per school. The low end of that is Conference USA at $450,000 per school. The Mountain West, and the reason I'm bringing the Mountain West is because that seems to be, if things don't work out, that would be the conference they would be kind of combining with in some manner. The Mountain West is an uneven distribution, so it's $4 million per school, except Boise State. Boise State gets a $7 million distribution because of the TV that they pull as a program is greater than the rest of the Mountain West historically. So these numbers that Canzano's throwing out would put them in the middle of all of that. And that's, I wouldn't say particularly surprising, because I think that would be the way those teams would fit if they, in the next 2 years, cannot get their way into a Power 4 conference. Because that's, for those who, again, who haven't been necessarily paying attention to the lawsuits, and I don't blame you if you haven't, the way Oregon State and Wazoo, their situation now is they basically have enough money to last a conference for 2 years and still take the kinds of money that they were getting before the future payouts. However, the NCAA has given them basically 2 years to grace period, because this has never really happened before where a conference has imploded to that level. You can't have two teams in a conference. So they've told them, like, look, in 2 years, you have to figure out what you're going to do. Otherwise, we're going to force the end of this conference. So at that point, if they haven't found a place in either, let's say, the Big 12 or the ACC, they would have to probably come up with something and merge with the Mountain West. It seems to be the most likely case. If not, bring all those teams over into a repopulated Pac-12, or however they're going to do it. Looking at a couple of other quick news and notes as we slowly wrap this up. There was a great question on our CFB. One of these kind of how do people feel? Do you actually identify with your fan base? Was a question by an LSU fan, John Rambeau. Beau, of course, being Beaux as a proper Cajun spelling. He says, for example, I absolutely love that LSU is seen as crazy, heavy drinking, all night partying Cajuns, and I love our atmosphere as wild as hell. But dude, that is so not me. Then it kind of goes on from there. Georgia fan S. Roach 91 said, I'll bark at anyone, from your kids to your grandmother. So yes, I suppose I identify with my fellow Georgia fans. Michigan fan, can't really say his name aloud. Well, I didn't go to Michigan, and my T-shirt is from Walmart, so I guess I do identify with my fellow Michigan fans. So again, a lot of this stuff is fun. It's always fun to think how you match up with them. I think we're going to use this opportunity to go ahead and wrap this up as a pretty neat hour. My goodness, would you look at that? Some last couple of shows went way beyond an hour. This is classic off-season time. This is our CFB Talk 192. This automatically turns into a recording as soon as it's stopped. If you want to hear what we talked about earlier, if you weren't around for it, we'll eventually get this up wherever you get your podcast as our CFB Talk. My name is Bobak Ha'Eri. I'm also I've been hired by Advanced Media's podcast to do the College Football Survivor Show with CBS Sports Shahan Jayaraja. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of all of us here at RCFB, thanks for listening. Now, I'm going to hang up and listen.